This is Brooke Brigman, and this is my oral presentation for the effects of learning and behavior for English 112 at Richmond Community College. I completed my research paper on the effects of learning and behavior and how behavior is directly impacted by types of learning and how learned behavior impacts us as children and adults. And there's learned behavior in many different forms. And shown through many different journals and experiments, such as operant conditioning, Pavlovian or classical conditioning, and reinforcement, which is types of learning that ultimately becomes a learned behavior. In Pavlovian or classical conditioning, a lot of times there's an association between things that ultimately becomes a learned behavior, whether it be that you have become sick after eating a certain food and ultimately you end up with a taste aversion against that food due to being sick after eating it, or even in a medical setting, if you end up with a phobia or a fear of dentist or doctor's office after having a traumatizing experience in a medical setting, and then you find that you're scared of dentist or doctor's offices or appointments. Also, a lot of times people with phobias, that becomes a learned form of Pavlovian conditioning or classical conditioning, where if someone was bitten by a spider and gets really sick and then later on forms a phobia of spiders due to being sick from the spider bite, which would be your stimulus response. So that would be an association between those things as a form of Pavlovian conditioning. In operant conditioning, a lot of times it is shown where through events the same goal or consequence is achieved, such as where a dog that learns that a whistle or the sound of food pouring into the bowl has a stimulus response, that because they know that they're about to be fed. Ultimately, that stimulus response would be a form of operant conditioning. And a lot of people actually teach their animals or train their animals based on operant conditioning, to where if you whistle and teach the animals to come because they're about to get fed from a whistle, they would have a stimulus response and knowing they're about to be fed from that sound. Also, in positive or negative reinforcement is where any time that learning is achieved based on a punishment or reward of a behavior would be a form of reinforced learning. And for example, if a toddler is throwing a temper tantrum and you take a toy away, that would be a form of reinforcement over time, that toddler learns that throwing a temper tantrum is ultimately going to lead to a toy being taken away. Or if a child throws something in the trash and then over time learns that they're going to be rewarded for doing so, that would be a form of reinforcement anytime that learning is achieved. And modeled behavior informs where children or adults, anything that's seen or modeled in front of them, whether experiments through where children that has been shown aggressive behavior as when they are younger think that it's acceptable as older adults, would be a form of modeled behavior that's been learned. I chose a lot of my references based on those breaking down of different forms of and types of learning. Each reference broke down a different form of learning through experiments with lab mice, or either through experiments with small children showing that aggressive behavior, and lab mice showing that anytime they actually hit a lever in a certain amount of time, they received a reward through conditioning or reinforcement. but this was Brooke Brigman, and that was for effects of learning and behavior.